When most people imagine the Vikings, they picture fire, longships cutting through icy seas, villages burning beneath dark skies, axes, raids, and warriors whose only law was violence. It is an image repeated in films, television, and popular culture for generations. But it is also incomplete, because the Vikings did not build their societies through chaos. They built them through law. Long before Scandinavia became unified under powerful kings, Viking communities relied on something that surprised many medieval visitors: public courts, formal legal assemblies, detailed customs, and laws that every free man was expected to understand. In fact, one of the most respected figures in Viking society was not always the strongest warrior. It was the law speaker, a man whose responsibility was to memorize and recite the laws before the entire community. Writing was rare. Memory became authority. If the laws were forgotten, society itself could begin to unravel. At the center of Viking justice stood the Thing, a public assembly where disputes, crimes, and political decisions were debated before free members of the community. These gatherings were far more than courts. They were the foundation of Viking society. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families defended relatives. Witnesses spoke before the crowd. Judgments were announced publicly. Justice belonged to the community, not to a distant king, not to a professional judge. This system often appears surprisingly modern. People presented evidence. Witnesses mattered. Compensation could replace endless bloodshed. Disputes were negotiated rather than settled immediately by violence. Yet appearances can be deceptive, because Viking justice was built upon one brutal assumption: your rights depended on who you were. Not everyone stood equally before the law. Free men enjoyed legal protection. Powerful families carried influence. Successful warriors commanded respect. Others did not. Slaves possessed almost no legal standing. Foreigners received fewer protections. The poor struggled to challenge wealthy households. Justice existed, but equality did not. And once someone lost the protection of the law, the consequences could be terrifying. Among all Viking punishments, none inspired greater fear than becoming an outlaw, because an outlaw was not merely someone who had broken the law. He became someone the law no longer recognized. To modern audiences, the worst punishment usually means execution. To the Vikings, there was something even more frightening. Imagine waking one morning to discover that the law no longer recognized your existence. No trial remained. No appeal was possible. No authority would protect you. From that moment forward, anyone could rob you. Anyone could attack you. Anyone could kill you. And no one would be punished for it. This punishment was known as outlawry. It was one of the harshest legal penalties in the Viking world, not because it guaranteed death, but because it stripped away everything that made a person part of society. Among the Norse, survival depended on community. Families worked together. Neighbors defended one another. Trade required trust. Justice depended on witnesses. Without those connections, even the strongest warrior became vulnerable. There were different forms of outlawry. The less severe sentence required a person to leave the region for several years. If they survived exile, they might eventually return and reclaim their place in society. But full outlawry was something else entirely. It meant permanent exclusion. Your property could be seized, your home abandoned, your family left to survive without your protection. and if someone encountered you on a lonely road, they could end your life without fear of legal consequences. The law itself had declared you outside humanity's protection. That was precisely the point. Instead of filling prisons, which scarcely existed in Viking Scandinavia, the legal system transformed the criminal into a problem the community no longer needed to solve. Society simply cast them out. The punishment reached far beyond the condemned individual. Families carried the shame. Children lost inheritance. Wives faced uncertain futures. Entire households could collapse because one person had been declared an outlaw. In many cases, exile proved just as deadly as execution. Scandinavia was not forgiving. Its winters were long. Its wilderness unforgiving. Food was scarce. Shelter difficult to find. An outlaw needed allies. Yet helping an outlaw could place others at legal risk as well. Isolation became part of the sentence. The most famous example may be Eric the Red. According to the Icelandic sagas, Eric was declared an outlaw after a series of violent disputes. Forced to leave Iceland, he sailed west into unknown waters. There he encountered a vast new land. He named it Greenland. One of history's greatest voyages began not with ambition, but with exile. Yet not every outlaw found opportunity. Most disappeared. Their names forgotten. Their stories buried beneath the silence of the North. And outlawry was only one part of Viking justice, because even those who remained inside the law could still be forced to fight for their lives. Sometimes inside the law itself. Not every dispute in the Viking world ended with witnesses, compensation, or exile. Some ended with steel. To modern societies, justice is decided inside courtrooms. For many Viking communities, justice could also be decided inside a marked circle of earth. This legal duel was known as holmgang. It was not a random brawl. It was not revenge. And it was not simply two angry men trying to kill one another. Holmgang was recognized by law. When negotiations failed, and when both sides believed they were in the right, a formal duel could determine the outcome. The community watched. Rules existed. Boundaries were established. Weapons were agreed upon. Witnesses ensured that both men followed the accepted customs. To the Vikings, this was more than combat. It was judgment. The belief behind holmgang reflected a very different understanding of justice. Truth was not always something that could be proven. Sometimes it was something that had to be defended. A man's courage, reputation, and willingness to stand before his accuser mattered almost as much as the evidence itself. Yet even here, Viking law attempted to impose limits. Some surviving Icelandic legal traditions describe carefully measured fighting areas. Certain procedures had to be followed before the duel began. Walking away without permission could mean forfeiting the dispute entirely. The duel itself became part of the legal process. But like many systems built on honor, it could be manipulated. A wealthy warrior could hire experienced fighters to represent him in some regions and periods. Professional duelists gained reputations. Strong men sometimes exploited weaker opponents by challenging them repeatedly. Justice slowly became influenced by strength rather than fairness. As abuses increased, attitudes toward holmgang began to change. By the 11th century, several Scandinavian societies had started restricting or outlawing the practice altogether. Even the Vikings eventually recognized that courage alone could not guarantee justice. Another solution often proved less dangerous: payment. Rather than continuing endless cycles of revenge, many disputes could be settled through wergild, literally a man price. Every free person possessed a legal value. If someone was killed unlawfully, the offender, or more often the offender's family, could compensate the victim's relatives. To modern ears, placing a price on human life sounds unsettling. To the Vikings, it prevented generations of bloodshed. Without compensation, one killing often produced another, then another. Entire families could remain trapped in revenge for decades. Wergild offered an escape, not forgiveness, not friendship, but peace. Still, peace depended on one critical condition. Both sides had to accept the payment. If they refused, the law could no longer prevent what came next. And in the Viking world, a blood feud could become far more terrifying than any official punishment. For the Vikings, law existed to prevent chaos. But when the law failed, chaos returned. A single killing could become the beginning of a conflict that lasted generations. If a family rejected compensation, or believed the court had reached an unjust decision, they could seek revenge themselves. What followed was known as a blood feud. It was not a random act of violence. It was an accepted social reality. Honor demanded a response. If a father was murdered, his sons were expected to remember. If a brother fell, his family carried the responsibility. If no one answered the insult, the family's reputation could suffer for generations. Justice was no longer about courts. It became about memory and vengeance. The Icelandic sagas preserve countless stories of feuds that began with relatively small disputes. A disagreement over land, an insult at a feast, a broken promise, a contested inheritance. What started as a personal conflict often expanded into something much larger. Neighbors chose sides. Allies joined. Marriages collapsed. Entire districts became divided. One death led to another, then another. Some feuds lasted so long that the people continuing them barely remembered how they had begun. That was precisely what Viking law tried to avoid. The thing existed to end disputes before they consumed entire communities. The system was never perfect, but it offered an alternative to endless retaliation. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, kings gradually strengthened centralized authority. Private vengeance slowly gave way to royal justice. Yet during the height of the Viking Age, that transformation remained incomplete. For many families, personal honor still outweighed legal judgment. Modern popular culture often presents Viking justice through a single terrifying image, the so-called blood eagle. According to several later Norse texts, this ritual involved the symbolic execution of certain enemies in an exceptionally brutal manner. It has become one of the most famous images associated with the Vikings. Movies portray it. Television dramatizes it. The Internet treats it as unquestioned history. The truth is more complicated. Most modern historians remain deeply divided over whether the blood eagle was ever carried out as described, or whether later medieval writers transformed symbolic poetry into literal history. The surviving sources are limited. Many were written centuries after the Viking Age. Some may reflect legend more than fact. Others argue that isolated examples cannot be ruled out. The evidence simply does not allow certainty, and that uncertainty tells us something important. Real Viking justice was already severe enough. It does not need exaggeration to remain frightening. Exile, blood feuds, legal duels, public judgment, social exclusion. These punishments shaped everyday life far more consistently than legendary executions ever did. Perhaps the greatest fear was not dying. It was living without law. For centuries, the Vikings have been remembered as raiders, conquerors, warriors who solved every problem with an axe. It is an image that refuses to disappear. Yet the deeper historians study Viking society, the more complicated that image becomes, because beneath every raid stood a functioning community. Communities require rules. Trade requires trust. Families require stability. Without law, the Viking world could never have survived as long as it did. Their legal system was not modern. It was not equal. And by today's standards, it could be extraordinarily harsh. But it was also remarkably sophisticated for its time. The thing gave free people a voice. The law speaker preserved centuries of legal tradition without written books. Compensation often prevented endless cycles of revenge. Even powerful chieftains could be challenged before the community. Justice belonged to society as much as it belonged to rulers. That does not mean justice was always fair. A wealthy family often held advantages. Slaves possessed few rights. Women generally had fewer legal protections than free men, though in some Scandinavian societies they enjoyed more legal standing than women in many other parts of medieval Europe. Every system reflected the values of its age. The Viking world was no exception. Perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate us. It feels strangely familiar, not because we would accept its punishments, but because we recognize its dilemmas. How much should honor matter? Can money truly compensate for a life? When should revenge end? Who deserves protection under the law? These questions have never completely disappeared. The Vikings answered them differently than we do, sometimes wisely, sometimes brutally, always within the world they understood. The greatest myth about Viking justice is not that it was violent. It certainly could be. The greatest myth is that it was lawless. In reality, the Vikings feared disorder more than punishment, because they knew something every civilization eventually learns. A sword may win a battle, but only laws can hold a society together. And perhaps that is the most surprising truth hidden behind the legend of the Vikings. The North was ruled not only by warriors, but by law.